The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck of the USS Defender as Lieutenant Sarah Chen made her way to the briefing room. Her boots clicked against the metal flooring with the steady rhythm of someone who had walked these corridors countless times. At 28, she had already earned respect among her peers as one of the most skilled Navy SEALs in her unit. Her small frame often fooled people into underestimating her, but those who knew her understood that behind her calm demeanor lay years of grueling training and real combat experience. Sarah had joined the Navy at 18, driven by a desire to serve her country and prove that gender meant nothing when it came to courage and capability. The path to becoming a SEAL had been brutal. She endured months of physical and mental torture during training, where instructors pushed candidates beyond their limits to weed out those who lacked the mental toughness required for the job. Many of her male counterparts had dropped out, unable to handle the pressure, but Sarah persevered. She learned to control her breathing underwater for impossible lengths of time, master complex weapon systems, and operate in hostile environments, where a single mistake could mean death. Her reputation had been built through 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan and Iraq. During her second deployment, she had single-handedly taken out a terrorist cell that had been planning an attack on a school. The mission required her to infiltrate their compound alone, gather intelligence, and neutralize 5 armed men without alerting nearby civilians. She completed the task with surgical precision, earning her the Silver Star and the admiration of her commanding officers. The USS Defender was supposed to be a routine assignment. The aircraft carrier was conducting training exercises in international waters, far from any active combat zones. Sarah had been assigned to the ship as part of a security detail, responsible for protecting high-value personnel and conducting counter-terrorism operations if needed. It seemed like an easy posting after years of dangerous missions in war zones. Captain Richard Morrison commanded the USS Defender with an iron fist. At 52, he was a career naval officer who had worked his way up through the ranks over 3 decades of service. Morrison came from an old military family where tradition and hierarchy were sacred. He believed strongly in the old ways, where orders were followed without question, and respect was demanded, not earned. The idea of women serving in combat roles, particularly as Navy SEALs, sat poorly with him. He saw it as political correctness gone too far, a weakening of military standards that he had sworn to uphold. Morrison had made his feelings known to his officers in private conversations, though he was careful never to express them officially. He believed that women lacked the physical and emotional strength required for the most demanding military roles. In his mind, having female SEALs on his ship was both a liability and an insult to the men who had earned their positions through what he considered proper channels. The tension between Morrison and Sarah had been building since she came aboard 6 months earlier. He questioned her orders more than those of male personnel, subjected her reports to extra scrutiny, and made subtle comments that suggested he doubted her abilities. Sarah handled these challenges professionally, knowing that confronting a superior officer directly could end her career. She focused on her duties and tried to prove her worth through actions rather than words. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine security inspection. Morrison had ordered Sarah to conduct a sweep of the lower decks, searching for potential security vulnerabilities. It was busy work, the kind of assignment typically given to junior personnel. But Sarah completed it thoroughly and professionally. When she submitted her report, Morrison rejected it, claiming it was incomplete and ordering her to redo the entire inspection. Sarah knew the report was thorough and accurate. She had documented every potential security concern, followed proper protocols, and presented her findings in the standard format. Morrison's rejection was clearly personal rather than professional, but she bit her tongue and redid the work without complaint. When she resubmitted an identical report 2 days later, Morrison rejected it again, this time claiming her recommendations were unrealistic and showed poor judgment. The pattern continued for weeks. Morrison would assign Sarah meaningless tasks, reject her work without valid reasons, and make increasingly hostile comments about her presence on his ship. Other officers began to notice the unfair treatment, but naval hierarchy meant that few were willing to speak up against their commanding officer. Sarah found herself isolated, facing hostility from the one person whose approval she needed most to advance her career. The situation reached a crisis point during a late-night duty shift. Sarah was conducting a routine patrol of the ship's armory when Morrison appeared unexpectedly. He had been drinking, something that was technically against regulations, but often overlooked for senior officers during peacetime operations. His face was flushed, and Sarah could smell alcohol on his breath as he approached her position. Morrison began questioning Sarah's presence in the armory, suggesting that she might be up to something suspicious. His accusations made no sense, given that armory patrols were standard procedure, but Sarah remained calm and professional. She explained her orders and showed him the patrol log, hoping to defuse the situation before it escalated further. Instead of backing down, Morrison became more aggressive. He accused Sarah of thinking she was better than everyone else, of using her gender to get special treatment, and of being a disgrace to the uniform. His voice rose with each accusation, and Sarah realized that months of resentment were finally boiling over into open hostility. Other crew members began to gather in the corridor outside the armory, drawn by the sound of Morrison's raised voice. Sarah knew that whatever happened next would likely determine the future of her military career. She had two choices: submit to Morrison's verbal abuse and hope it would end there, or stand up for herself and risk the consequences of challenging a superior officer. Morrison stepped closer to Sarah, his face now inches from hers. His breath reeked of alcohol as he continued his tirade, accusing her of being weak, incompetent, and unworthy of the SEAL designation. He told her that women had no place in combat roles, and that her very presence was putting real soldiers at risk. Each word was carefully chosen to cut deep, designed to break her spirit and force her to admit defeat. Sarah felt her training kick in. Years of preparation had taught her to remain calm under pressure, to think clearly, even when facing mortal danger. She knew that Morrison was trying to provoke her into doing something that would justify disciplinary action. If she lost her temper, if she said or did anything that could be construed as insubordination, her career would be over. But as Morrison continued his assault, something inside Sarah began to change. She had endured months of harassment and abuse, always taking the high road and hoping that professionalism would eventually win out. She had sacrificed her own dignity in the name of military discipline. But Morrison's attack was crossing lines that no officer should cross, regardless of rank. The crowd in the corridor had grown larger, and Sarah could see the faces of sailors watching the confrontation unfold. Some looked uncomfortable with Morrison's behavior, while others seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. Sarah realized that this moment would define not just her own future, but how women in the military would be perceived by everyone witnessing this encounter. Morrison's verbal assault continued for several more minutes before he apparently decided that words alone were not enough to achieve his goal. His hand moved to his service weapon, and Sarah's training immediately identified the threat. Years of combat experience had taught her to recognize dangerous situations before they escalated to violence, and every instinct she possessed was now screaming warnings. The armory fell silent, except for the sound of Morrison's heavy breathing. The gathered crowd could sense that something terrible was about to happen, but none of them seemed willing or able to intervene. Sarah found herself alone, facing a superior officer who had clearly lost control of himself and was now potentially dangerous to everyone around him. Morrison's hand rested on his holstered weapon as he continued to stare at Sarah with undisguised hatred. She could see in his eyes that alcohol and months of resentment had combined to create a volatile situation that could explode at any moment. The professional disagreement had transformed into something much more personal and dangerous, and Sarah realized that her military training might not be enough to get her out of this situation safely. Morrison's hand tightened around his service weapon as he took another step towards Sarah. The tension in the armory had become suffocating, and she could feel the eyes of dozens of crew members watching from the corridor. Time seemed to slow as Sarah's combat-trained mind began processing the situation with the cold calculation that had kept her alive through multiple deployments. Her training had taught her to read body language, to identify the precise moment when a tense situation would turn violent. Morrison's shoulders were hunched forward in an aggressive posture. His breathing had become rapid and shallow, and his pupils were dilated from both alcohol and adrenaline. Every signal indicated that he was on the verge of doing something that would change both of their lives forever. Morrison drew his weapon in one swift motion, the metallic sound of the gun leaving its holster echoing through the confined space. Gasps came from the watching crowd as the captain pointed his service pistol directly at Sarah's head. His hand was steady despite the alcohol in his system, and Sarah could see his finger hovering dangerously close to the trigger. "You think you're so tough," Morrison snarled, his voice now thick with rage and drink. "You think you belong here with real warriors. Let's see how tough you are now, SEAL." The weapon was less than 3 feet from Sarah's face, close enough that she could see down the barrel. Her training had prepared her for many dangerous situations, but being held at gunpoint by her own commanding officer in the middle of a supposedly safe military vessel was not something that any manual could have covered. The irony was not lost on her that after surviving firefights with terrorists and navigating minefields in foreign countries, she might die at the hands of an American officer on an American ship. Sarah's mind raced through her options. Morrison was too close for her to attempt to disarm him without risking getting shot in the process. The cramped confines of the armory gave her little room to maneuver, and any sudden movement might trigger his already unstable emotional state into violence. She could see that his finger was now actually touching the trigger, meaning that even the slightest pressure could discharge the weapon. The watching crew members stood frozen in horror. Several junior officers had appeared in the corridor, but none of them seemed willing to challenge their commanding officer, even when he was clearly out of control. The rigid hierarchy of military life meant that intervening against a superior officer could result in court-martial, regardless of the circumstances. They were trapped between their duty to obey orders and their moral obligation to prevent a tragedy. Sarah forced herself to remain absolutely still while her mind worked through the tactical situation. She had been in similar positions before during combat operations, when enemy fighters had gotten the drop on her or her team. The key was to stay calm, think clearly, and wait for the right moment to act. Panic would only make the situation worse and increase the chances of someone getting killed. Morrison's accusations continued to pour out in a stream of alcohol-fueled hatred. He told Sarah that she was a fraud who had only achieved her position through political correctness and special treatment. He claimed that real SEALs would never accept her as an equal, and that her presence weakened the entire unit. Each word was designed to humiliate and demoralize, but Sarah's training helped her maintain emotional control even while staring down the barrel of a loaded weapon. The captain's rant revealed months of pent-up resentment and frustration. He spoke about the old days when the military was composed entirely of men who understood duty and honor. He expressed his belief that allowing women into combat roles was part of a broader societal weakness that threatened America's military superiority. His words showed a deep-seated prejudice that went far beyond simple disagreement with military policy. As Morrison continued his tirade, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in his behavior that her training had taught her to recognize. His grip on the weapon was becoming less steady as the adrenaline rush began to fade and the alcohol continued to affect his coordination. His breathing remained elevated, but the pattern had changed in a way that suggested his initial surge of rage was beginning to give way to uncertainty about what to do next. Sarah realized that Morrison had not actually planned this confrontation. His decision to draw his weapon had been impulsive, driven by alcohol and emotion rather than any real intent to commit violence. This gave her a potential advantage, because people acting on impulse were more likely to make mistakes that could be exploited by someone with proper training and a clear head. The crowd in the corridor had continued to grow as word of the confrontation spread throughout the ship. Sarah could see faces she recognized among the watchers, including some of the crew members she had worked with during her time aboard the vessel. Their expressions ranged from shock to fear to confusion. But she also noticed something else in a few faces: respect for how she was handling an impossible situation. One of the junior officers in the crowd was Lieutenant Commander James Walsh, the ship's executive officer and Morrison's second-in-command. Walsh had always treated Sarah professionally and had even defended her work when Morrison criticized it unfairly. She could see the conflict in his face as he watched his commanding officer threaten a fellow service member. His position gave him the authority to intervene, but challenging Morrison could effectively end his own career. Walsh took a tentative step forward, then stopped when Morrison noticed his movement and swung the weapon briefly in his direction before returning it to point at Sarah. The message was clear. Anyone who interfered would face the same threat. The executive officer stepped back, his hands raised in a placating gesture, unwilling to escalate the situation further. Sarah used the brief distraction to shift her weight slightly, preparing herself for action if an opportunity presented itself. Her movement was so subtle that Morrison didn't notice, but she was now in a better position to react if he became distracted again. Years of hand-to-hand combat training had taught her exactly how to disarm an armed opponent, but the technique required precise timing and a momentary lapse in the attacker's attention. Morrison returned his full attention to Sarah, pressing the barrel of his weapon closer to her forehead. She could feel the cold metal against her skin and smell the gun oil that coated the weapon. The situation had reached its most dangerous point, because Morrison now had to make a decision about what to do next. He couldn't stand there holding a gun on her indefinitely, and his options were limited to either shooting her or backing down and facing the consequences of his actions. "You think you're better than me," Morrison whispered, his voice now barely audible to anyone except Sarah. "You think your fancy training makes you special. But you're nothing. Just another woman playing soldier, while real men do the fighting." Sarah looked directly into Morrison's eyes as he spoke, using a technique she had learned during interrogation training. She was searching for any sign of uncertainty or weakness that she could exploit. What she saw surprised her. Beneath the rage and alcohol-fueled bravado, there was fear. Morrison was as scared as anyone else in that armory. Perhaps more so because he knew that his career, and possibly his freedom, were now at stake, regardless of how the situation ended. The captain's hand began to tremble slightly, and Sarah realized that the full weight of his actions was beginning to sink in. He had drawn a weapon on a subordinate in front of dozens of witnesses, an action that would likely result in court-martial and imprisonment even if no shots were fired. His military career was already over, and he was starting to understand the magnitude of his mistake. This moment of realization created the opportunity that Sarah had been waiting for. Morrison's attention was momentarily divided between his immediate anger and his growing awareness of the consequences he would face. His grip on the weapon loosened slightly as his mind grappled with the reality of his situation. Sarah struck with the speed and precision that had made her one of the most feared operators in her SEAL unit. Her right hand shot up to grab Morrison's wrist, while simultaneously twisting to move her head out of the weapon's line of fire. Her left hand came up to strike his elbow joint, using leverage and momentum to break his grip on the pistol. The entire movement took less than 2 seconds, and left Morrison stunned and disarmed before he fully understood what had happened. The weapon clattered to the floor of the armory, the sound echoing through the space like a gunshot. Morrison staggered backward, clutching his wrist where Sarah had applied pressure to nerve points that temporarily disabled his grip. The watching crowd let out a collective gasp as they realized the immediate danger had passed. But nobody moved to retrieve the fallen weapon or restrain Morrison. Sarah stepped back and assumed a defensive posture, ready to react if Morrison tried to retrieve his weapon or attack her with his hands. Her years of training had taught her never to assume that disarming an opponent ended a threat, because desperate people often became more dangerous when they had nothing left to lose. Morrison's career was ruined regardless of what happened next, which meant he might be willing to do anything to salvage some measure of control over the situation. Morrison stared at his empty hands in disbelief, as if he couldn't understand how his weapon had been taken away so quickly. The alcohol in his system made it difficult for him to process what had just occurred, and his face showed a mixture of confusion, rage, and dawning horror at the magnitude of his actions. He looked around at the watching faces in the corridor, seeing his career and reputation crumbling before his eyes. The silence stretched for long moments as everyone tried to process what they had witnessed. A commanding officer had threatened a subordinate with a deadly weapon, only to be disarmed by the very person he had been trying to intimidate. The power dynamic had shifted completely, but nobody seemed certain about what should happen next. Military protocol provided no clear guidance for a situation where a captain had essentially attempted to commit murder in front of his own crew. Lieutenant Commander Walsh finally found his voice and stepped forward, his face pale but determined. As the executive officer, he had the authority and responsibility to take command when the captain was unable to perform his duties, and Morrison's behavior clearly qualified as such a situation. Walsh's hands shook slightly as he reached for his radio to contact the ship's security team and medical personnel. "Captain Morrison, you need to stand down immediately," Walsh said, his voice carrying the authority of his position, despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. "Security teams are en route to secure this area. I'm assuming command of this vessel until further notice." Morrison's face cycled through a range of emotions as he processed Walsh's words. The alcohol had clouded his judgment, but he was sober enough to understand that his second-in-command had just effectively removed him from power. His military career, which had spanned 3 decades and represented his entire adult identity, was ending in the most humiliating way possible. Sarah remained in her defensive stance, watching Morrison carefully for any sign that he might try to continue the confrontation. She had seen desperate people do unpredictable things before, and Morrison still represented a potential threat, even without his weapon. Her training had taught her that the most dangerous moments often came after the initial crisis seemed to have passed, when people's desperation made them willing to take extreme risks. The ship's security team arrived within minutes, their boots thundering through the corridors as they responded to Walsh's emergency call. Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez led the team, a veteran with 25 years of service who had seen almost everything the Navy could throw at him. However, even his extensive experience had not prepared him for the sight of his commanding officer being held at bay by a disarmed SEAL, while the executive officer assumed emergency command. Rodriguez quickly assessed the situation and began issuing orders to secure the area and separate the principals involved in the confrontation. He had Morrison escorted to his quarters under guard, while medical personnel were summoned to evaluate the captain's condition. The weapon on the armory floor was carefully collected as evidence, and statements were taken from the numerous witnesses who had observed the incident. Sarah found herself in the unusual position of being both victim and victor in the confrontation. Her quick thinking and superior training had prevented what could have been a tragedy, but she was still a subordinate who had physically overpowered her commanding officer. Military justice would need to sort out the complex legal and procedural issues raised by such an unprecedented incident. The news of the confrontation spread throughout the USS Defender within hours. Despite official efforts to maintain operational security, sailors talked in hushed tones about the female SEAL who had disarmed their captain, and opinions were sharply divided about what had really happened and who was at fault. Some viewed Sarah as a hero who had prevented a potential murder, while others questioned whether her actions had been appropriate, regardless of the provocation. Admiral Patricia Hayes arrived aboard the USS Defender within 48 hours of the incident, flown in by helicopter from Norfolk Naval Base to conduct a preliminary investigation. Hayes was known throughout the Navy as a fair but tough officer who had broken numerous barriers during her own rise through the ranks. As one of the few female admirals in the service, she understood both the challenges that women faced in military careers and the importance of maintaining discipline and order. The investigation revealed a pattern of harassment and discrimination that had been building for months before the confrontation in the armory. Witness statements from crew members painted a clear picture of Morrison's inappropriate treatment of Sarah, including documented instances where he had rejected her work without cause and made discriminatory comments about women in combat roles. Medical examination of Morrison showed significant alcohol impairment at the time of the incident, along with evidence of chronic drinking that had apparently been ongoing for some time. Naval investigators discovered that the captain had been struggling with personal problems, including a recent divorce and financial difficulties that had apparently contributed to his deteriorating behavior and decision-making. Sarah's actions during the confrontation were analyzed in detail by military experts who concluded that she had shown remarkable restraint and professionalism under extreme circumstances. Her decision to disarm Morrison rather than attempt to retreat or call for help was deemed appropriate given the immediate threat to her life. The speed and skill with which she had neutralized the threat demonstrated the value of her SEAL training and justified the military's investment in female special operations personnel. The formal court-martial proceedings began 6 weeks later at Naval Station Norfolk. Captain Morrison faced multiple charges, including assault with a deadly weapon, conduct unbecoming an officer, and violation of military regulations regarding alcohol consumption. The prosecution had dozens of witnesses and clear evidence of Morrison's misconduct, making conviction virtually certain. During the trial, Morrison's defense attorney attempted to portray his client as a victim of changing military standards that had forced him to work with personnel he considered unqualified. The lawyer argued that alcohol dependency was a medical condition that should be treated rather than punished, and suggested that Sarah's presence on the ship had created unnecessary tension that contributed to the incident. Sarah testified for 2 full days, describing in detail the months of harassment she had endured and the events leading up to the confrontation in the armory. Her testimony was calm and professional, focusing on facts rather than emotions, and she answered even hostile cross-examination with the same composure she had shown during the actual incident. The most compelling testimony came from the crew members who had witnessed Morrison's behavior over time. Officer after officer described instances of discriminatory treatment, inappropriate comments, and obvious hostility toward Sarah that had made everyone uncomfortable. Their accounts painted a picture of a commanding officer who had allowed personal prejudices to compromise his professional judgment and create a hostile work environment. Lieutenant Commander Walsh's testimony proved particularly damaging to Morrison's defense. As the executive officer, he had observed Morrison's behavior firsthand and had documented several instances where the captain's treatment of Sarah had violated Navy regulations. Walsh admitted that he should have taken action sooner, but had hoped that Morrison would eventually adjust his attitude without formal intervention. The court-martial panel deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Morrison was sentenced to 5 years in military prison, reduction in rank to ensign, forfeiture of all pay and benefits, and dismissal from the Navy. The sentence sent a clear message throughout the military that discrimination and threats against female service members would not be tolerated. Sarah's career flourished in the aftermath of the incident. She was promoted to lieutenant commander and assigned to lead a new training program designed to prepare female personnel for special operations roles. Her experience aboard the USS Defender became a case study in military academies, teaching future officers about the importance of maintaining professional standards, regardless of personal beliefs. The broader impact of the incident extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The Navy implemented new training programs focused on preventing discrimination and harassment, with particular attention to the challenges faced by women in traditionally male-dominated roles. Morrison's court-martial became precedent for how similar cases would be handled in the future. Sarah used her newfound prominence to advocate for other women facing discrimination in the military. She spoke at conferences and training sessions, sharing her story and encouraging female service members to report inappropriate behavior rather than enduring it in silence. Her message was simple: professionalism and competence should be the only measures that matter in military service. Years later, Sarah would reflect on the incident as a turning point not just in her own career but in the broader struggle for equality within the military. The moment when Morrison pointed a gun at her head could have ended in tragedy. But instead, it became a catalyst for positive change that benefited countless women who followed in her footsteps. The USS Defender returned to normal operations under new command, but the incident left a lasting impact on the ship's culture. Crew members who had witnessed the confrontation became more aware of discrimination and more willing to speak up when they saw inappropriate behavior. The ship developed a reputation for excellence in diversity and inclusion that persisted long after most of the original witnesses had transferred to other assignments. Morrison served 3 years of his sentence before being released on parole. He struggled to adjust to civilian life, haunted by the knowledge that his actions had not only destroyed his own career, but had also strengthened the cause he had tried to oppose. His moment of drunken rage had backfired completely, providing ammunition for those who argued that women belonged in all military roles. Sarah eventually achieved the rank of commander and was given command of her own special operations unit, becoming one of the most respected officers in the Navy. She never forgot the lesson she learned in that armory: that true strength came not from weapons or rank, but from maintaining professionalism and composure under the most extreme pressure. The incident became part of Navy lore, told and retold in training sessions and informal gatherings. Each telling reinforced the same message: that courage, competence, and character were the qualities that defined a true warrior. Regardless of gender, Sarah Chen had proven that point in the most dramatic way possible, turning a moment of personal danger into a victory for equality and justice that would inspire future generations of military women. The confrontation that began with a captain holding a gun to her head ended with that same captain learning the most important lesson of his military career. Never underestimate a Navy SEAL, especially one who had earned her place through merit, determination, and unwavering commitment to the values that made America's military the finest fighting force in the world.